Good morning. Welcome to the first edition of Ask Matt. I invited 1548 Heights members and friends to ask me any question they want about the Bible, religion, Christianity, 1548 Heights, or myself, and I prompted you with, I've always wondered. And many of you sent me questions of things you've always wondered. Now, I told you I would answer these in under 2 minutes. I did not know you all would be so thoughtful in your answers. So I'm going to back off the 2-minute commitment, and you can decide whether it's worth watching when you see how long the video is. And I'll try to make them as brief and concise as possible. So, the first question I chose to answer is from Ann Brownlee in Cherokee, Texas, who happens to be my sister-in-law. God bless me. Ann writes, I've always wondered about the various translation, pros and cons, and which one is the closest to the original language. And she adds, do not say the King James Version. So it's a good question. Many of you all may have been wondering that too. What's the best Bible translation? Which is the closest to the original? Which one should I use? Well, let me start with just two basic theories of Bible translation. The first is what's called formal equivalence, in which the Bible translator, translating from the Hebrew in the Old Testament and the Greek or the Aramaic in the New Testament, try to replicate as closely as possible the original form of the thought being expressed. Another way to think of this is word for word translation. And some of the examples of this are the American Standard Bible, which was published in the earliest 20th century, the New American Standard Version, which was the first Bible I used after my baptism at age 21 for 10 years, all the way up to seminary. I still have many scriptures memorized in that version, and they have a sort of distinct tone to them. And also, for instance, the English Standard Version, which is getting very popular. The challenge of the word-for-word translations is the Hebrew and Greek are not constructed like English is. And so trying to go word for word can make it sort of stilted and awkward to read and to say. It just doesn't translate exactly into the kind of English sentence structure we have, subject, verb, object, etc. In Greek, you want to emphasize something, you put the word at the beginning of the sentence, whether it's a verb or noun. And so there's formal equivalence. There's second, functional equivalence, which tries to replicate as closely as possible the function of the thought. And you might think of this as thought for thought translation as opposed to word for word. And examples of this are the New Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, the New Living Translations, etc. And then there are, in addition, sort of a type of dynamic equivalence is paraphrased, which don't necessarily match word for word or thought for thought, but almost more paragraph for paragraph, theme for theme. And the most popular form of this is the Message by Eugene Peterson, or the Living Bible. Here's my feelings about paraphrase. I love to use the Message as a conversation partner for my regular Bible reading. Almost every time I preach, I'll print it out, the passage I'm going to preach on in the New Revised Standard Version, and I'll print out the Message, and I'll just look at them and kind of compare them and get a feel for them. But I don't recommend the paraphrase versions as your primary reading or studying Bible. So let's look at an example from the New Testament to each of these theories, the word for word, thought for thought, and then the paraphrase. So Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, New American Standard Version, word for word. Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. New Revised Standard Version, thought for thought. Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So the NRSV translates the word for righteousness as piety. The word actually means righteousness in the original, but they're saying, what's the meaning here? You know, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And now let's look at a paraphrase. Be especially careful when you are trying to be good so that you don't make a performance out of it. It might be good theater, but the God who made you won't be applauding. See how different the paraphrase is? But it's great to use as a conversation. Kind of what's a different way, a more informal way of saying this. Now here's a very important thing to know. All translation is interpretation. All translation is interpretation. Virtually anything you try to translate, you're going to have to make interpretative choices about what is meant. And so it's not just what is being said, but what is being meant is the challenge. And so, for instance, when the Apostle Paul addresses churches in his epistles, he'll say, brothers, this is what I want you to do. Well, that's the literal wording. So the NASV will say brothers. The NRSV, being a thought-for-thought translation, will say, what does Paul mean here? Does he mean only the men in the congregation? Brothers? Or was this just a customary address? And the whole congregation is going to hear it being read, and so the NRSV will render it brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters, this is what I want you to do. So that's an example of how translation is almost always interpretation. And of course it goes to matters much deeper than this. For instance, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, where are we now? 6 minutes 32 seconds. Romans chapter 3 verse 25, the whole passage, chapter 3 verse 21 through 25. Now let's read the NRSV. Whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood. That's Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement. Well, this word for sacrifice of atonement in the Greek is the word hilasterion, which only occurs twice in the New Testament. And it refers to how Jesus' death on the cross activates or actualizes reconciliation between people and God. It's a very deep theology, atonement theology. So the NRSV takes that word hilasterion and renders it sacrifice of atonement. But the NASV, New American Standard Version, says, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation or propitiatory sacrifice in his blood. Now, who cares, right? Well, there's just tiny little differences here. A propitiation is more like something offered up to appease an angry God. A sacrifice of atonement is more like something offered to cover sins. I'm being very simplistic here. But so these translators bring in their understanding, their theology of the atonement to render a translation. That's why all translation is interpretation. Okay, so to answer the question, which translation is closest to the original language? They're all working from the same basic manuscripts. And so it's really a matter of how they choose to interpret what style, informal, formal, word for word, thought for thought, and what theological views they bring to that. So, related to that, in part 2 of Ask Matt, I'm going to talk about different Bibles. And Bibles are not just the translations, they're the whole package, the study notes, the introductions, the footnotes, all that. I'm going to just talk about why those are so different, okay? Keep sending me those questions. I'll send out another email prompt. God bless you. Goodbye.